Standing at gate 12 with my boarding pass in hand, I watched Derek rush past me without a backward glance, his arm wrapped around Ashley Brooks as they headed toward the departure lounge for the charter flight to Denver. He was so focused on impressing his new flight instructor that he completely forgot about his wife standing there with luggage, waiting for the romantic getaway we'd planned for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Derek didn't know was that Ashley Brooks worked for me, and by the time their plane landed, neither of them would have jobs to return to. The look on his face when I revealed I owned Skyline Flight Academy would haunt him forever, but it would give me the satisfaction I'd been craving for weeks. The morning started like any other Tuesday at Riverside Regional Airport. I'd arrived early to handle some paperwork at Skyline Flight Academy before Derek and I were supposed to catch our 2 p.m. flight to Denver for what was meant to be our second honeymoon. We'd been married for 5 years, and lately, things had felt strained between us. Derek worked as a commercial pilot for Southwest Airlines, but he'd been taking additional flight instruction courses at various academies around Texas, always claiming he wanted to expand his certifications. I supported his ambitions completely, even though it meant he was away from home more often than I liked. Derek had no idea that 3 years ago, I'd inherited my grandfather's aviation business and transformed it into one of the most successful flight training academies in the region. To him, I was just Rachel Martinez, the accountant who worked from home and managed finances for small businesses. I'd never corrected his assumption because, honestly, I enjoyed having something that was completely mine. My grandfather had taught me to fly when I was 16, and aviation had always been my passion, but Derek had this way of making me feel like my interests were less important than his career. The inheritance had come with conditions that required me to keep my ownership private for the first 5 years, while I proved I could run the business successfully. My lawyer, Robert Singh, had structured everything through a trust that kept my name off public records. Even the staff at Skyline knew me only as the silent partner who preferred to work behind the scenes. It was perfect cover, allowing me to observe how the academy operated without the complications of employees knowing the boss was married to one of their students. That Tuesday morning, I'd gone to the academy early to review the monthly financial reports. Business was booming with a 6-month waiting list for private pilot training and corporate contracts that were bringing in more revenue than my grandfather had ever imagined possible. I was particularly proud of our instrument rating program, which had achieved a 98% first-time pass rate. The instructors we'd hired were exceptional, especially the newer additions like Ashley Brooks, who joined us 4 months ago with impeccable credentials and glowing references from her previous academy in Arizona. James Carter, our academy manager, was updating me on the week's schedule when I noticed Derek's name on the advanced maneuvering course roster. I felt a flutter of excitement, thinking maybe this was his way of surprising me by training at my academy. Perhaps he'd finally figured out that I owned the place and wanted to support my business. The thought made me smile as I imagined how proud he'd be when he discovered what I'd built. Ashley Brooks was listed as his primary instructor for a 3-day, intensive course that would conclude with a check ride on Friday. I'd observed several of her lessons from the control tower, and she was undeniably skilled. Her students consistently performed well, and she had a natural teaching ability that made complex concepts seem simple. She was also strikingly beautiful, with long auburn hair and the kind of confidence that commanded attention in any room. I'd hired her based purely on qualifications, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit I'd noticed how male students seemed particularly motivated in her classes. The morning paperwork session stretched longer than expected, and I realized I'd need to rush home to pack for Denver. Derek and I had planned this trip for months, and I'd been looking forward to 3 days away from work where we could focus on reconnecting. We'd been distant lately, and I hoped the change of scenery might help us remember why we'd fallen in love in the first place. Our relationship had been rocky since his father's death 6 months ago, and grief had made him withdrawn. and irritable. I was gathering my files when James mentioned that Derek's afternoon lesson with Ashley had been moved to an earlier time slot. Something about a scheduling conflict with another student. The information registered casually until I glanced at the clock and realized Derek should have been home helping me pack. Our flight was at 2, and here he was taking an unscheduled lesson that would run right up until departure time. A knot formed in my stomach, but I pushed down the suspicion. Derek was passionate about flying, and maybe he'd just lost track of time. I decided to swing by Hangar 7 where the advanced lessons took place, thinking I could surprise Derek and maybe grab lunch together before heading to the airport. The walk across the tarmac was familiar, and I waved to several mechanics and ground crew members who knew me as the woman who occasionally showed up to observe operations. None of them knew I signed their paychecks, and I preferred it that way. It gave me valuable insight into how the business really operated when the boss wasn't officially watching. Approaching the hangar, I could hear voices inside and recognized Derek's laugh immediately. He had a distinctive way of laughing when he was trying to impress someone, slightly louder than normal, with an edge of performative charm that I'd learned to identify over the years. The sound stopped me in my tracks because it was the same laugh he'd used when we first met, the one that had made me feel like the most interesting woman in the room. Hearing it directed at someone else sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the November air. I moved closer to the hangar's side window, staying out of sight while trying to get a better view of what was happening inside. Derek stood next to the Cessna 172 we used for advanced training, gesturing animatedly while Ashley nodded and smiled. She was wearing her standard flight instructor uniform, but something about her posture suggested this conversation was about more than aviation procedures. They stood closer together than necessary, and when Ashley laughed at something Derek said, she touched his arm in a way that felt intimate and familiar. My heart started racing as I watched them interact. This wasn't the dynamic between a student and instructor. There was an ease between them that spoke of private conversations and shared jokes. When Ashley moved to check something on the aircraft, Derek's eyes followed her with an intensity that made my stomach clench. I'd seen that look before, in the early days of our relationship when Derek couldn't take his eyes off me. Now it was directed at another woman, and the betrayal felt like a physical blow. I forced myself to stay calm and observe objectively. Maybe I was misreading the situation. Maybe Derek had simply found a mentor who understood his aviation goals better than I did. But then Ashley turned back toward him, and Derek reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face. The gesture was tender and possessive, unmistakably romantic. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There was no misinterpreting what I was witnessing. The conversation inside the hangar became more animated, and I caught fragments of their exchange through the partially open door. Derek was telling Ashley about our trip to Denver, but not in the way a devoted husband should speak about a romantic getaway with his wife. Instead, he was complaining about having to go, about how I'd been pressuring him to spend more time together when all he wanted was to focus on his career advancement. Ashley listened sympathetically, occasionally making supportive comments about how demanding spouses could be when they didn't understand aviation passion. I felt sick listening to Derek describe our marriage as a burden, painting me as a clingy wife who didn't appreciate his professional ambitions. He told Ashley how I couldn't understand his need for advanced training, how I treated his flying like an expensive hobby instead of recognizing it as serious career development. The irony was devastating since I'd been the one secretly funding improvements to the very academy where he was training, upgrading equipment, and hiring the best instructors specifically to support pilots like him. The worst moment came when Ashley asked if Derek thought our marriage would survive his career changes. Without hesitation, Derek replied that he'd been questioning whether we were compatible long-term. He said I was holding him back from opportunities that required flexibility and commitment, implying that a wife who wanted predictable time together was somehow limiting his potential. Ashley nodded knowingly, mentioning how difficult it could be when partners weren't equally invested in aviation excellence. I backed away from the window, my mind reeling from what I'd discovered. This wasn't just an affair. It was a complete betrayal of everything I thought our marriage represented. Derek wasn't just cheating physically. He was emotionally investing in another woman while disparaging me as an obstacle to his success. The fact that this was happening at my own academy, with my employee, using my resources, made the situation even more unbearable. Walking back to my car, I felt a strange calm settling over me. The initial shock was giving way to something more powerful, a clarity that cut through the emotional chaos. Derek had made his choice, and now I would make mine. He thought he was cleverly managing a secret affair while pursuing his aviation dreams, completely unaware that those dreams were happening in facilities I owned, with instructors I employed, using aircraft I'd purchased. The drive home was surreal. I packed methodically for Denver, even though I already knew the trip wouldn't happen as planned. Derek arrived 30 minutes before we needed to leave for the airport, breathless and apologetic about running late. He claimed the lesson had gone longer than expected because Ashley was such a thorough instructor, wanting to ensure he mastered every aspect of the advanced maneuvers. His enthusiasm for Ashley's teaching methods felt like salt in a wound, but I smiled and nodded appropriately. During the drive to Riverside Regional Airport, Derek talked excitedly about his training progress and how much he was learning from Ashley's innovative techniques. He mentioned how lucky he felt to have found such a skilled instructor, completely oblivious to the fact that I'd hired her. Several times he brought up Ashley's insights about aviation career advancement, quoting her advice about positioning himself for better opportunities. I responded minimally, my mind focused on what would happen once we reached the terminal. The airport was typically busy for a Tuesday afternoon, with business travelers and tourists moving through security checkpoints and gathering at departure gates. Derek seemed distracted, checking his phone frequently and scanning the crowds, as if looking for someone specific. When we reached the security line, he suddenly announced that he'd forgotten something important in the car and needed to go back to retrieve it. He suggested I go through security and wait for him at the gate since our boarding would begin soon. Something about his urgency felt suspicious, but I agreed to meet him at gate 12. I made it through security quickly and found a seat with a clear view of the departure area. From that vantage point, I could see most of Terminal B, including the main entrance where passengers arrived from the parking areas. I didn't have to wait long before I spotted Derek walking through the terminal, but he wasn't alone. Ashley Brooks was beside him, pulling a small rolling suitcase and carrying a travel bag that suggested she was planning to be away for several days. My heart hammered as I watched them approach the gate area together. They were careful not to walk too closely or touch in public, but their body language screamed intimacy. Derek was animated, gesturing as he spoke, while Ashley listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested she found him fascinating. They looked like a couple excited about a romantic trip, not a student and instructor with a professional relationship. I remained in my seat, partially hidden behind a pillar, as they joined the boarding line for the Denver flight. Derek was holding 2 boarding passes, and I realized with crystal clarity that Ashley was meant to be his travel companion, not me. They'd planned this together, probably weeks in advance, and Derek had simply failed to inform me that our second honeymoon had become his romantic getaway with another woman. The audacity was breathtaking. When boarding began, Derek pulled out his phone and sent what I assumed was a text message to me. My phone buzzed with a notification that I ignored. Instead, I watched as Derek and Ashley moved toward the departure gate, talking quietly and occasionally sharing secretive smiles. Derek looked happier and more relaxed than I'd seen him in months, transformed by the prospect of time alone with Ashley. As they reached the gate agent, Derek suddenly stopped and looked around the terminal with a confused expression. I could see him scanning the waiting area, obviously looking for me. He pulled out his phone again and made what appeared to be a call that went to voicemail. Ashley stood beside him, checking her watch and looking slightly impatient about the delay. After a few minutes of searching, Derek shrugged and said something to Ashley that made her laugh. Then they handed their boarding passes to the gate agent and disappeared down the jetway together. I sat there for a full 10 minutes after their flight departed, processing what had just happened. Derek had abandoned me at the airport for another woman without even having the courage to tell me directly. He'd simply expected me to figure it out when he didn't show up at the gate. The cowardice was almost as insulting as the adultery itself. But what Derek didn't know was that Ashley Brooks worked for me, and by leaving me stranded at the airport, he'd just given me the perfect opportunity to ensure they both faced consequences for their betrayal. I pulled out my phone and finally read Derek's text message. It was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as an emergency. He claimed that Ashley had contacted him about a mechanical issue with the aircraft they'd planned to use for his next lesson, and she needed him to fly to Denver immediately to help with an insurance inspection. He wrote that he was sorry to miss our trip, but that this was a career opportunity he couldn't pass up, and he promised to make it up to me when he returned. The lies were so elaborate and detailed that I almost admired the effort he'd put into crafting the deception. I stood up and walked to the large windows overlooking the tarmac where I could see their plane taxiing toward the runway. In a few hours, Derek and Ashley would be in Denver, probably checked into a hotel room and celebrating what they thought was their successful deception. They had no idea that by tomorrow morning, both of their aviation careers would be over, and Derek would discover that the woman he'd abandoned at the terminal owned the very academy where he'd met his lover. The satisfaction of that revelation was going to be worth every moment of pain I'd felt watching them together. But first, I had some calls to make and arrangements to put in place. Derek wanted to prioritize his aviation career over our marriage, and I was about to show him exactly what that choice would cost him. The first call I made was to Nicole Parker, my best friend since college, and the only person who knew about my ownership of Skyline Flight Academy. Nicole worked as an attorney specializing in employment law, and over the years, she'd become my unofficial advisor on both personal and business matters. When she answered, I was still sitting in Terminal B, watching planes take off through the massive windows. "Rachel, shouldn't you be on a plane to Denver right now?" Nicole's voice carried that familiar note of concern that told me she could sense something was wrong even through the phone. "Derek left me at the airport," I said simply, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "He's on that plane to Denver, but not with me. He's with Ashley Brooks, one of my flight instructors." The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds, before Nicole exploded with a string of creative profanity that would have impressed even the most seasoned pilots. "That absolute piece of garbage," she finally managed. "What do you need me to do?" I appreciated that Nicole didn't waste time with shocked questions or expressions of sympathy. She understood immediately that I was in problem-solving mode, not emotional processing mode. "I need you to help me figure out the cleanest way to handle Ashley's employment situation. She's violated our workplace ethics policy by having a relationship with a student, and she's used company resources to facilitate an affair." "How much evidence do you have?" Nicole asked, and I could hear her switching into lawyer mode. "Enough," I replied, thinking about the lesson schedules that showed Ashley and Derek meeting far more frequently than necessary, the hangar security, footage that would show their intimate interactions, and the fact that Ashley was currently on an unauthorized trip with a student. "But I want to make sure we do this right. I don't want her to have any grounds for wrongful termination claims." Nicole was quiet for a moment, and I knew she was mentally reviewing employment law statutes. With clear policy violations and documented evidence, you're on solid ground. "But Rachel, are you sure you want to handle this as a business matter? This is your husband we're talking about." "My husband just abandoned me at an airport for another woman," I said, feeling the anger finally starting to surface. "He's been lying to me for months, taking advantage of my business without knowing it, and talking about me like I'm some kind of burden. The business aspect is actually the easiest part to deal with right now." I stood up and walked toward the exit, deciding I needed to get to Skyline Flight Academy to start documenting everything properly. The terminal felt suffocating, filled with happy travelers heading off on adventures while my own trip had become a nightmare of betrayal and deception. "Can you meet me at the academy in an hour? I want to review Ashley's employment file and make sure we have everything documented before I make any official moves." "I'll be there," Nicole promised. "And Rachel, I know this is devastating, but you're going to come out of this stronger. Derek just made the biggest mistake of his life." After hanging up with Nicole, I called my sister Lisa, who lived in Austin, but maintained a pilot's license and occasionally helped with Skyline's marketing efforts. Lisa had never particularly liked Derek, though she'd been diplomatic about her concerns over the years. Her instincts about people were usually accurate, and I realized she'd probably seen something in Derek that I'd missed or ignored. "Lisa, I need you to do me a favor," I said as soon as she answered. "Can you check the flight tracking for Southwest Airlines and see if Derek Thompson is listed as crew on any flights to Denver today?" "That's oddly specific," Lisa replied. "Is everything okay?" "Derek told me he had to fly to Denver for an emergency aircraft inspection, but I think he's lying. I need to know if he's actually working or if this is personal travel." Lisa was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her typing on her computer. She had access to industry databases through her marketing work, and tracking pilot schedules was relatively straightforward if you knew where to look. "Rachel, Derek isn't listed on any Southwest crew manifests today. In fact, according to this, he's scheduled for 3 days off starting today." The confirmation hit harder than I'd expected, even though I'd already known Derek was lying. Hearing it stated so definitively made the betrayal feel more real, more calculated. He hadn't been called away for an emergency. He'd planned this trip with Ashley and constructed an elaborate lie to cover his tracks. "There's more," Lisa continued, her voice growing concerned. "I'm seeing some charter flight records that might interest you. A Cessna citation was filed for a flight plan to Denver this afternoon with 2 passengers listed. The pilot is registered as an independent contractor, but the aircraft is registered to a shell company that traces back to Ashley Brooks." My mind raced as I processed this information. Ashley owned her own aircraft, which explained how she could afford to take Derek on these trips, and why she'd positioned herself as such an expert on aviation career advancement. She wasn't just a flight instructor looking for extra income. She was a wealthy woman with her own aviation business who'd targeted Derek for reasons I couldn't yet understand. "Lisa, I need you to dig deeper into Ashley Brooks. Find out everything you can about her background, her business interests, her previous employment. Something about this situation doesn't add up." "Consider it done," Lisa replied. "And Rachel, whatever Derek has gotten himself into, you don't deserve this. You've always been too good for him." The drive back to Skyline Flight Academy gave me time to think strategically about my next moves. Derek and Ashley had made several critical mistakes that would make their downfall much easier to orchestrate. They'd used academy resources for personal business, violated clear workplace policies, and left a trail of evidence that would be impossible to deny. But more importantly, they'd underestimated me completely. Derek had no idea that his wife owned the academy where he'd been training, which meant he had no idea how much power I actually held in his aviation world. Ashley knew she worked for a mysterious silent partner, but she'd never connected that partner to Derek's wife. Their ignorance was about to become their biggest liability. James Carter was in his office when I arrived at Skyline, reviewing student progress reports and preparing for the next day's schedule. He looked surprised to see me, since I usually didn't come to the academy twice in one day unless there was an emergency. "Rachel, I thought you were supposed to be on your way to Denver," he said, glancing at his watch. "Did your flight get delayed?" "Something like that," I replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. "James, I need to review Ashley Brooks' employment file and any documentation related to her interactions with Derek Thompson." James raised an eyebrow, but didn't question my request. He'd worked with me long enough to recognize when I was operating in full business mode, and he trusted my judgment implicitly. Is there a problem I should know about? There might be, I said carefully. I have reason to believe Ashley may have violated our workplace ethics policy regarding relationships with students. I want to review everything before making any decisions. While James retrieved Ashley's file, I logged into the Academy's security system to review footage from Hangar 7 over the past few weeks. The cameras were positioned to monitor aircraft operations and safety protocols, but they also captured interpersonal interactions between instructors and students. What I saw confirmed my worst suspicions and provided documentation that would make any legal challenges impossible. The footage showed Ashley and Derek engaging in clearly romantic behavior during multiple training sessions. There were lingering touches, intimate conversations in corners where they thought they weren't being observed, and body language that screamed personal involvement rather than professional instruction. On one particularly damning recording from the previous week, Ashley and Derek could be seen kissing passionately next to the Cessna 172 after a lesson had officially ended. Ashley's employment file revealed additional concerning information. Her references from the Arizona Academy where she'd previously worked were legitimate, but her departure had been sudden and unexplained. When James called to verify her background, during the hiring process, her former employer had been professionally diplomatic, but noticeably reluctant to provide enthusiastic recommendations. Reading between the lines now, I suspected Ashley might have had similar inappropriate relationships with students at her previous position. Nicole arrived just as I was finishing my review of the documentation. She took one look at my expression and immediately understood that the situation was worse than I'd initially described. "Show me what you've found," she said, settling in. Next to me at the computer, I walked Nicole through the security footage, the employment file discrepancies, and the flight records that Lisa had uncovered. With each piece of evidence, Nicole's expression grew more serious. She took notes on her legal pad and occasionally asked clarifying questions about Academy policies and procedures. "This is actually worse than a simple affair," Nicole said. "Finally, Ashley appears to have been systematically targeting students for personal relationships, which suggests a pattern of predatory behavior rather than an isolated incident of poor judgment." The revelation that Derek might not be Ashley's first victim added another layer of betrayal to the situation. I'd hired her based on her qualifications and references, trusting that she would maintain professional standards and contribute positively to the Academy's reputation. Instead, she'd used her position to pursue inappropriate relationships and potentially exploit students who were paying significant amounts of money for professional instruction. "What are our options?" I asked Nicole. "Immediate termination." "For cause, obviously," Nicole replied. "The policy violations are clear and well documented, but I think we should also consider whether to report this to the Federal Aviation Administration. If Ashley is using her instructor credentials to facilitate inappropriate relationships with students, that's a violation of professional standards that could affect her ability to maintain her licenses." The idea of involving the FAA hadn't occurred to me, but Nicole was right. Flight instructors held positions of trust and authority, and using those positions for personal gain or inappropriate relationships was exactly the kind of behavior that regulatory agencies took seriously. A formal complaint could result in Ashley losing her instructor certificates permanently, effectively ending her aviation career. James had been listening quietly to our conversation, but now he spoke up with information that added another dimension to the situation. "Rachel, there's something else you should know about Ashley's recent activity. She's been accessing student files and training records outside of normal business hours, including information about students she's never worked with directly." My blood ran cold as I processed the implications. What kind of information has she been accessing? "Financial records, contact information, training histories," James replied. I noticed it a few weeks ago but didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed she was doing research to improve her teaching methods. But looking at it now, it seems like she might have been targeting specific students based on their financial status or personal situations. Nicole and I exchanged glances, both recognizing that we were dealing with something much more serious than a simple workplace affair. Ashley had been systematically collecting information about academy students, possibly to identify vulnerable targets for financial or personal exploitation. Derek might not have been randomly seduced. He might have been specifically chosen based on information Ashley had gathered from his student file. "We need to notify law enforcement," Nicole said firmly. "This goes beyond employment violations into potential fraud or identity theft territory." I felt overwhelmed by the scope of what we were uncovering, but also strangely energized by the clarity of purpose it provided. Derek's betrayal was devastating on a personal level, but Ashley's systematic abuse of her position threatened the integrity of my business and the safety of all my students. She had to be stopped, and Derek's involvement with her had given me the perfect opportunity to expose everything. "Let's start with immediate termination and then build the case for regulatory and criminal complaints," I decided. "But I want to time this carefully. Derek and Ashley think they're safely in Denver enjoying their romantic getaway. I want them to have enough time to get comfortable before their world falls apart." Nicole nodded approvingly. "The element of surprise will be crucial. If Ashley suspects she's been discovered, she might try to destroy evidence or flee. We should move quickly but strategically." I spent the next hour documenting everything we'd discovered and preparing termination letters for Ashley's employment. Nicole helped me craft language that clearly stated the reasons for dismissal, while protecting the academy from potential legal challenges. James compiled all the security footage and file access records that demonstrated Ashley's policy violations and inappropriate behavior. As we worked, I found myself thinking about Derek and how completely he'd been manipulated by Ashley. Part of me felt sorry for him, recognizing that he might be as much a victim of Ashley's scheming as her other targets. But a larger part of me remained furious about his willingness to betray our marriage and abandon me at the airport without explanation. Even if Ashley had targeted him specifically, Derek had made choices that demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for our relationship. My phone rang as we were finishing the documentation, and I was surprised to see Derek's name on the caller ID. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. I wanted to hear how he would explain his absence and what lies he would tell to cover his tracks. "Rachel, honey, I'm so sorry about this afternoon." Derek's voice sounded artificially concerned, like an actor reading lines from a script. "The aircraft inspection turned out to be more complicated than Ashley expected, and we're going to need to stay in Denver until Thursday to complete all the paperwork." I marveled at his ability to sound sincere while telling such elaborate lies. "That sounds stressful," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "I hope everything works out with the inspection." "It will," Derek assured me. "Ashley really knows her stuff when it comes to regulatory requirements. I'm learning so much from working with her on this project." The irony of Derek praising Ashley's expertise while having no idea that I employed her was almost amusing. "Well, I'm glad you're getting such valuable experience," I said. "I'll see you when you get back." After hanging up, I turned to Nicole and James with a grim smile. "Derek just confirmed that he's planning to stay in Denver until Thursday. That gives us 2 days to complete our investigation and prepare for their return." Nicole was already pulling out her phone to contact her investigator friend who specialized in aviation fraud cases. "I'll have someone start digging into Ashley's financial records and business dealings. If she's been running cons on flight students, there might be other victims we don't know about yet." James offered to contact other flight academies in the region to see if they'd had any problems with Ashley Brooks, or similar situations with other instructors. The aviation community was relatively small, and information about problematic employees often circulated informally among academy managers. As we wrapped up our initial planning session, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. The shock and emotional devastation of discovering Derek's betrayal was being replaced by focused determination to ensure that both he and Ashley faced appropriate consequences for their actions. Derek had chosen to prioritize his affair over our marriage, and Ashley had violated her professional responsibilities to pursue inappropriate relationships with students. By Thursday, when they returned from Denver expecting to resume their secret relationship, they would discover that their actions had been exposed and their aviation careers were over. Derek would learn that the wife he'd abandoned at the airport owned the academy where he'd met his lover, and Ashley would face termination, regulatory complaints, and potential criminal charges. The satisfaction of that revelation was going to make all the pain and humiliation I'd experienced worthwhile. But first, Nicole and I had more evidence to gather and more strategic planning to complete. Derek and Ashley had made the mistake of underestimating me, and I was going to show them exactly how costly that error would be. I drove home that evening, with my mind racing through everything that needed to be accomplished over the next 2 days. The house felt strange and empty without Derek, but also peaceful in a way it hadn't been for months. I realized that I'd been unconsciously walking on eggshells around Derek's moods and schedule changes, accommodating his increasing demands for space and independence, without recognizing how those changes were connected to his affair. Lisa called just as I was settling in with a glass of wine and my laptop to continue researching Ashley's background. "Rachel, you're not going to believe what I've found about Ashley Brooks," she said without preamble. "Try me," I replied, opening a new document to take notes. Ashley has been involved in at least 3 similar situations over the past 5 years, Lisa explained. She worked at academies in Arizona, Nevada, and California, and each time she left under mysterious circumstances, after being there for less than a year. I found some forum discussions where pilots mentioned inappropriate behavior by instructors, and Ashley's name came up multiple times. The pattern was becoming clearer, and it painted Ashley as a serial predator who moved from academy to academy, targeting vulnerable students for personal and possibly financial gain. Derek wasn't her first victim, and if she hadn't been stopped, he wouldn't have been her last. "There's more," Lisa continued. "Ashley's aircraft registration shows some irregularities that suggest possible insurance fraud. The plane she used to fly Derek to Denver was reported as damaged in a hailstorm 6 months ago, but the repairs were never properly documented. She may have collected insurance money for repairs that were never completed." I felt sick thinking about how many levels of deception Ashley had been operating on simultaneously. She wasn't just an unfaithful employee, she was apparently a career criminal who specialized in aviation-related fraud. Derek had gotten involved with someone far more dangerous than he could have imagined. "Lisa, I need you to compile everything you've found into a comprehensive report," I said. "Nicole thinks we should involve law enforcement, and this information will be crucial for building a strong case." "Already on it," Lisa replied. "I'll have everything organized and documented by tomorrow morning." After hanging up with Lisa, I spent the evening reviewing academy policies and procedures to ensure that we'd followed proper protocols for investigating employee misconduct. The last thing I wanted was for Ashley to escape consequences because of procedural errors or incomplete documentation. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the future of my marriage and what Derek's betrayal meant for our relationship. Even if Ashley had targeted and manipulated him, Derek had made fundamental choices that demonstrated his willingness to lie, cheat, and abandon me when it served his interests. Trust, once broken so completely, would be impossible to rebuild. But strangely, I felt more optimistic about my personal future than I had in months. The process of investigating Ashley's crimes and preparing to expose Derek's affair had reminded me of my own strength and capabilities. I'd built a successful business, maintained financial independence, and surrounded myself with loyal friends and family who supported me unconditionally. Derek had thought he was trading up when he chose Ashley over me, but he was about to discover that he'd actually thrown away the best thing in his life for a woman who saw him as nothing more than another mark in her ongoing criminal enterprise. The irony was perfect, and I was going to savor every moment of his realization. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November clarity that made flying conditions perfect throughout Texas. I woke early, my mind immediately focused on the tasks ahead rather than dwelling on the empty space beside me in bed where Derek should have been. The previous day's discoveries about Ashley's criminal pattern had transformed my approach from simple workplace discipline to comprehensive legal action that would ensure she never victimized another student. Nicole arrived at my house at 7, with coffee and a thick folder containing everything her investigator had uncovered overnight. Her friend Marcus Webb specialized in aviation fraud cases and had worked through the night to compile a devastating profile of Ashley Brooks' activities across multiple states. The evidence was more extensive than we'd dared hope for, painting a picture of systematic criminal behavior that spanned years. Marcus found connections to at least 7 flight academies where Ashley worked briefly before leaving under questionable circumstances, Nicole explained as we spread documents across my dining room table. In each case, she targeted male students with significant financial resources or valuable aviation connections. The pattern is unmistakable. I studied the timeline Marcus had created, noting how Ashley moved strategically from state to state, never staying anywhere long enough for investigations to develop, but always leaving behind suspicious circumstances. Her employment at Skyline represented her longest tenure at any single academy, which suggested she'd found something particularly valuable worth extending her usual pattern. "Look at this," Nicole said, pointing to financial records that showed Ashley's income significantly exceeded what Skyline paid her. She's been receiving regular payments from a consulting company that doesn't appear to provide any legitimate services. Marcus thinks it might be a front for money laundering or fraud proceeds. The consulting company was registered in Delaware with minimal public information, but Marcus had traced its bank accounts to discover a pattern of deposits that coincided with Ashley's employment at various academies. The amount suggested she was receiving substantial payments for activities beyond flight instruction, possibly related to information she gathered about wealthy students or their business connections. "There's something else," Nicole continued, her expression growing more serious. Marcus found evidence that Ashley may have been involved in aircraft theft or fraudulent sales. 3 planes registered to her consulting company matched descriptions of aircraft reported stolen from airports where she previously worked. My hands trembled slightly as I processed the implications. Ashley wasn't just a serial seductress targeting vulnerable students. She was running sophisticated criminal operations that used flight academies as cover for theft, fraud, and possibly worse crimes. Derek had stumbled into a relationship with someone far more dangerous than either of us had realized. Lisa called as Nicole and I were reviewing the most damaging evidence against Ashley. My sister's voice carried an urgency that immediately caught my attention, and I put her on speaker so Nicole could hear the latest developments. "Rachel, I've been tracking Derek and Ashley's movements in Denver, and something very strange is happening," Lisa began. "They're not staying at any hotels under their own names, but I found credit card records showing Derek has been paying for expensive accommodations and meals that seem way beyond what a pilot's salary could support. Ashley might be funding their trip," I suggested, thinking about the mysterious consulting income we'd discovered. "That's what I thought initially," Lisa replied, "but the credit card transactions show Derek's card being used for purchases that don't make sense. He's bought expensive jewelry, chartered a helicopter for sightseeing, and paid for what appears to be a private aircraft inspection that cost $15,000. Nicole and I exchanged concerned glances. Derek didn't have access to that kind of money unless he'd been borrowing against our home equity or accessing savings accounts I didn't know about. The possibility that Ashley had manipulated him into financing their lavish Denver trip with money he couldn't afford to spend added another layer of victimization to an already complex situation. "Lisa, can you trace where Derek got the money for these purchases?" I asked. "I'm working on it," she replied. "But Rachel, there's something else you need to know. I found records showing Ashley has been in contact with aviation insurance companies about Derek's qualifications and flight history. She's been positioning herself as his career advisor and may have convinced him to apply for positions or insurance policies that could benefit her financially." The revelation that Ashley had been actively working to monetize her relationship with Derek made me feel nauseated. She'd seduced my husband not just for personal gratification, but as part of a calculated scheme to exploit his aviation credentials and financial resources. Derek thought he was having an affair with a passionate flight instructor who understood his career ambitions, but he was actually being systematically defrauded by a professional criminal. I spent the morning working with Nicole to compile comprehensive documentation of Ashley's criminal activities while simultaneously preparing for her termination when she returned from Denver. The evidence was overwhelming, but we wanted to ensure that every legal requirement was met and every possible challenge was anticipated before we moved forward. James Carter proved invaluable in this process, providing detailed records of Ashley's access to student files and her interactions with Academy systems. The pattern of after-hours data access was particularly damning, showing that Ashley had systematically reviewed financial information and personal details for dozens of students beyond those she'd been assigned to instruct. She was definitely hunting for specific targets, James observed as we reviewed the computer logs. "Look at how she focused on students with high net worth or connections to major aviation companies. Derek wasn't randomly selected, he was chosen because your marriage gave him access to financial resources and business connections that made him particularly valuable." The realization that my own success had made Derek a target for Ashley's schemes added a bitter irony to the situation. She'd identified him as a promising mark, partly because of his connection to me, completely unaware that I owned the very academy where she worked. Her greed and criminal ambition had led her to target the one person whose betrayal would result in her complete exposure and downfall. Marcus Webb called Nicole around noon with additional information that elevated our concerns to an urgent level. His investigation had uncovered evidence suggesting Ashley might be connected to an organized network of aviation criminals who specialized in exploiting flight training environments for various illegal activities. "This isn't just one woman running isolated cons," Marcus explained during a conference call. "Ashley appears to be part of a larger operation that targets flight academies specifically because they provide access to aircraft, wealthy clients, and opportunities for insurance fraud. The FBI has been investigating similar patterns in other states." Nicole immediately suggested contacting federal authorities to report Ashley's activities and coordinate our evidence with any existing investigations. The possibility that Skyline Academy had been infiltrated by organized criminals made the situation about much more than Derek's affair or even Ashley's individual crimes. I agreed to federal involvement, but insisted that we coordinate the timing carefully to ensure Ashley and Derek would be present when arrests were made. They were scheduled to return to Cedar Falls Thursday evening, and I wanted them both available for questioning when law enforcement moved forward. "There's one more thing we should consider," Nicole said after we'd finished planning our approach with Marcus. "Derek may have been an unwitting accomplice in some of Ashley's activities. If she convinced him to provide access to financial accounts or sign documents he didn't understand, he could face criminal charges himself. The possibility that Derek might be criminally liable for Ashley's schemes hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense given the pattern of manipulation and financial exploitation we'd uncovered. Derek's eagerness to impress Ashley and advance his aviation career could have made him vulnerable to signing contracts or providing information that facilitated her criminal activities. I spent Wednesday afternoon reviewing our joint financial accounts and credit reports to determine if Derek had made any unauthorized transactions or commitments that could affect our shared assets. What I discovered made my blood run cold and confirmed my worst fears about the extent of Ashley's manipulation. Derek had applied for a significant home equity loan using our house as collateral, apparently with plans to invest in what he described as an aviation consulting venture. The loan documents listed Ashley's consulting company as the intended recipient of the funds, and Derek's signature appeared on agreements that would have given Ashley access to nearly $200,000 of our home's equity. Fortunately, the loan application was still pending approval, and I was able to contact our bank immediately to halt the process. The loan officer confirmed that Derek had presented the application as a joint venture with his wife's full knowledge and consent, using my known involvement in aviation businesses to strengthen his credibility with underwriters. Mrs. Martinez, your husband seemed very confident that you would approve this investment, the loan officer explained. He mentioned that you owned aviation-related businesses and would understand the potential returns from consulting work in the industry. The irony was staggering. Derek had used my actual aviation expertise and business success to convince lenders that Ashley's fraudulent consulting company was a legitimate investment opportunity. He'd essentially tried to steal money from our shared assets to fund the criminal enterprise run by the woman he was cheating with, all while believing he was making a smart business decision that would impress his new lover. Nicole helped me file paperwork to formally block the loan application and protect our assets from any future attempts by Derek to access them without my knowledge. We also discovered that Derek had provided Ashley with copies of financial documents and business records that could have given her access to my legitimate aviation investments if she'd chosen to pursue identity theft or corporate fraud. Derek has essentially given Ashley a complete roadmap to your financial life, Nicole observed grimly. Even if she hasn't used that information yet, she has everything she would need to cause serious damage to your businesses and personal accounts. I felt violated in ways that went beyond the emotional betrayal of Derek's affair. Ashley had gained access to my most sensitive financial information through Derek's naive cooperation, and she could potentially use that access to destroy everything I'd built over years of careful business development. The scope of potential damage was terrifying. My phone rang Wednesday evening with another call from Derek, and I steeled myself to listen to whatever lies he would tell about his extended stay in Denver. His voice carried a forced cheerfulness that barely concealed underlying anxiety, and I suspected Ashley might be coaching him on what to say. Rachel, honey, the aircraft inspection is taking longer than expected, Derek began, following what was clearly a rehearsed script. Ashley thinks we might need to stay through Friday to complete all the documentation properly. I know this is frustrating, but this experience is really valuable for my career development. That does sound frustrating, I replied, keeping my tone neutral while Nicole listened from across the room. I hope the extra time proves worthwhile. It definitely will, Derek assured me. Ashley has been introducing me to some amazing opportunities in the aviation consulting field. There might be a chance for me to get involved in some really lucrative projects that could change our financial situation significantly. I marveled at Derek's enthusiasm for opportunities that were actually criminal schemes designed to defraud him and potentially implicate him in Ashley's illegal activities. His eagerness to believe Ashley's promises about career advancement had made him the perfect victim for her sophisticated manipulation tactics. That sounds exciting, I managed to say. I look forward to hearing more about these opportunities when you get home. After hanging up, I turned to Nicole with a grim smile. Derek just confirmed that Ashley is actively recruiting him for her criminal enterprise. He thinks he's being offered legitimate consulting work, but he's actually being set up as an accomplice or fall guy for her schemes. Nicole shook her head in disgust. Derek's greed and gullibility are going to be his downfall. Ashley has played him perfectly, using his career ambitions and marital dissatisfaction to make him vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation she specializes in. We spent Wednesday evening finalizing our coordination with federal authorities and ensuring that all evidence was properly documented for criminal prosecution. Marcus Webb had connected us with FBI agent Sarah Collins, who specialized in aviation fraud cases, and confirmed that Ashley Brooks was indeed a person of interest in multiple ongoing investigations. We've been tracking Ashley's activities for months, but she's been very careful to avoid detection, Agent Collins explained during a secure phone call. Your evidence fills in crucial gaps in our investigation and provides the kind of direct documentation we need to build a solid case. Agent Collins requested that we maintain normal operations at Skyline Academy until Ashley returned from Denver, allowing law enforcement to coordinate arrests and evidence seizure at the optimal moment. The plan was to allow Ashley and Derek to return to Cedar Falls thinking their deception had been successful, then move simultaneously to arrest Ashley and question Derek about his involvement in her schemes. I agreed to cooperate fully with the federal investigation, but requested that I be present when Ashley was confronted with her termination and arrest. Agent Collins understood that my personal investment in the case warranted special consideration, and she agreed to coordinate timing so that I could witness Ashley's downfall firsthand. Thursday morning dawned gray and cold, matching my mood as I prepared for what would likely be the most difficult day of my life. In a few hours, Derek and Ashley would return from Denver expecting to resume their secret relationship and continue, exploiting the opportunities they thought they'd created. Instead, they would discover that their activities had been exposed and that serious criminal charges were pending. Nicole arrived early to review our final preparations and ensure that all legal requirements had been met for Ashley's termination. The documentation was comprehensive and unassailable, covering policy violations, criminal activity, and breach of professional standards that would make any legal challenges impossible to sustain. "Are you ready for this?" Nicole asked as we drove toward Skyline Academy for what would be Ashley's final day as an employee. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," I replied, and I meant it. The past 3 days had been devastating, but also transformative, showing me exactly how strong I could be when faced with betrayal and deception. Derek and Ashley had underestimated me completely, and they were about to learn the cost of that mistake. Agent Collins and her team were already in position at the academy when Nicole and I arrived, conducting final equipment checks and reviewing arrest procedures. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Allow Ashley to report for work normally, then confront her with evidence of her crimes while simultaneously executing search warrants for her aircraft and consulting company records. James Carter had been briefed on the federal investigation and understood his role in maintaining normal operations until arrests were made. His professionalism and discretion had been invaluable throughout the investigation, and I made a mental note to ensure he received appropriate recognition for his cooperation and support. Derek and Ashley's flight landed 20 minutes ago, Agent Collins reported as we monitored air traffic control communications. They should arrive at the academy within the hour, assuming they follow their normal pattern of coming here directly after returning from trips. I felt my heart rate accelerate as the moment of truth approached. In less than an hour, Derek would discover that his wife owned the academy where he'd met his lover, and Ashley would learn that her carefully constructed criminal enterprise was collapsing around her. The satisfaction of that revelation was going to make all the pain and humiliation of the past few days worthwhile. The sound of Derek's truck pulling into the Skyline Academy parking lot sent an electric jolt through my nervous system. From my position in the administrative office, I could see him through the window, looking relaxed and satisfied as he stretched after the drive from the airport. Ashley emerged from the passenger side, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light, as she gathered her travel bag and what appeared to be shopping bags from their Denver excursion. They moved together with the easy familiarity of lovers returning from a romantic getaway, completely oblivious to the federal agents positioned strategically around the academy grounds. Derek held the door open for Ashley as they entered the building, and I could hear their laughter echoing down the hallway as they approached the main office area where Ashley would normally check in after returning from any absence. Agent Collins spoke quietly into her radio, coordinating with her team as Derek and Ashley made their way through the building. The plan was to allow Ashley to settle into her normal routine before making contact, giving the federal agents time to position themselves optimally and ensuring that all evidence could be secured simultaneously with her arrest. James Carter greeted Derek and Ashley with his usual professional courtesy, asking about their trip while maintaining the pretense that their absence had been related to legitimate aircraft inspection work. Derek launched enthusiastically into a fabricated account of complicated maintenance issues and regulatory requirements, clearly having rehearsed his story during the flight home from Denver. The inspection turned out to be much more complex than we initially expected, Derek explained to James, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed his deception was working perfectly. Ashley's expertise in regulatory compliance made all the difference in resolving the documentation issues. Ashley nodded along with Derek's performance, occasionally adding technical details that sounded impressive but were clearly designed to deflect any deeper questions about their actual activities in Denver. Her demeanor was calm and professional, showing no signs of concern about potential consequences for her unauthorized absence or inappropriate relationship with Derek. I watched from the office doorway as Ashley moved toward her desk to check messages and review the training schedule for the remainder of the week. She appeared completely comfortable and confident, suggesting that she had no suspicion her criminal activities had been discovered. The normalcy of her behavior was almost surreal, given what I knew about her extensive fraud schemes and pattern of exploiting students across multiple academies. Derek lingered near Ashley's workspace, clearly reluctant to end their time together, even though maintaining appropriate professional distance would have been the logical choice if they were genuinely concerned about concealing their relationship. Their body language continued to broadcast intimacy and personal connection, providing additional real-time evidence of the inappropriate relationship that violated academy policies. "I should probably head home and check in with Rachel," Derek said finally, though his tone suggested he was in no hurry to leave Ashley's presence. "She's been asking a lot of questions about the inspection delays, and I want to make sure she doesn't get suspicious about anything." The casual way Derek discussed deceiving me while standing in my own academy was breathtaking in its audacity. He was literally planning his continued lies while surrounded by evidence of my success and business acumen, completely unaware that every word he spoke was being monitored by federal agents preparing to arrest his lover for criminal fraud. Ashley responded to Derek's comment with a knowing smile that suggested they'd discussed strategies for managing suspicious spouses during their Denver trip. "Just stick to the technical details about aircraft regulations," she advised. "Most people's eyes glaze over when you start talking about FAA compliance requirements. The more boring and complicated you make it sound, the less likely she'll be to ask follow-up questions." I felt a surge of rage listening to Ashley coach Derek on how to lie to me more effectively. She was not only manipulating him for her own criminal purposes, but actively helping him deceive the wife who had unknowingly provided the business environment where their affair had flourished. The level of betrayal was staggering, and I looked forward to seeing Ashley's confidence evaporate when she learned exactly who she'd been underestimating. Agent Collins appeared beside me in the doorway, speaking quietly enough that Derek and Ashley couldn't overhear our conversation. "We're ready to move forward whenever you give the signal," she said. "All evidence preservation measures are in place, and my team has confirmed that Ashley's aircraft and consulting company offices are being secured simultaneously." "I want to be the one who tells her she's fired," I said firmly. "Before you make the arrest, I want Ashley to know exactly who she's been working for and what her crimes have cost her." Agent Collins nodded understandingly. "We'll follow your lead. Once you've had your say, we'll move in for the arrest and formal questioning." I took a deep breath and stepped into the main office area where Derek and Ashley were still discussing their fabricated story about aircraft maintenance delays. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed me approaching, and I could see surprise and concern flickering across Derek's face as he tried to process why I was at the academy instead of waiting for him at home. "Rachel?" Derek said, his voice carrying forced casualness that didn't quite mask his underlying anxiety. "I didn't expect to see you here. I was just finishing up with Ashley and getting ready to head home to fill you in on everything that happened in Denver. I'm sure you were, I replied, allowing a slight edge to creep into my voice. Actually, Derek, I'm glad you're both here. There are some things we need to discuss about Ashley's employment and your training program. Ashley's professional composure remained intact, but I noticed her eyes sharpening with what might have been wariness as she tried to interpret the undercurrents in my tone. Mrs. Martinez, if there are any concerns about Derek's training progress, I'd be happy to provide detailed reports on his advancement in the program. The irony of Ashley offering to provide reports on Derek's progress while having no idea that I owned the academy was almost amusing. She was speaking to me with the deferential tone appropriate for a student's concerned spouse, completely unaware that she was actually addressing her employer and the woman whose husband she'd been systematically seducing and defrauding. Actually, Ashley, my concerns aren't about Derek's training progress, I said, moving closer so that I could observe her reaction when the truth was revealed. My concerns are about your violation of academy policies regarding inappropriate relationships with students, your unauthorized access to confidential student files, and your involvement in what appears to be an extensive criminal fraud operation. The color drained from Ashley's face as she processed my words, and I could see her mind racing to understand how I could possibly know about activities she thought had been carefully concealed. Derek looked completely bewildered, his gaze shifting between Ashley and me as he tried to comprehend what was happening. I'm not sure what you're implying, Ashley said carefully, her professional mask beginning to slip as she recognized the seriousness of the accusations. If there's been some kind of misunderstanding about my conduct or Derek's training, I'm sure we can resolve it through proper channels. There's no misunderstanding, I replied, enjoying the growing panic in Ashley's eyes. You see, Ashley, there's something important that you don't know about me. Something that's going to make this conversation very interesting for both of you. Derek stepped forward, his confusion giving way to defensive anger. Rachel, what are you talking about? Ashley is a professional flight instructor who's been helping me advance my career. If you're upset about the Denver trip, I can explain everything about the aircraft inspection. Derek, there was no aircraft inspection, I said, turning to face my husband directly. Ashley took you to Denver for a romantic getaway funded with money she convinced you to borrow against our house. Money that was intended to finance her criminal consulting business and help her flee the country once her fraud schemes were exposed. The shock on Derek's face was complete and devastating. His mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to process information that contradicted everything he believed about his relationship with Ashley and their Denver trip. I could see him mentally reviewing conversations and events, beginning to recognize the manipulation and deception that had characterized every aspect of their affair. Ashley's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand the situation," she said desperately, her voice rising with panic as she realized her carefully constructed facade was collapsing. "Derek and I have developed a professional relationship that includes legitimate business opportunities. If you're concerned about academic policies, we can address those issues through proper administrative procedures." "Ashley," I said, savoring the moment of revelation that I'd been anticipating for days, "I am the administrative procedure. I'm not just Derek's wife who happened to stumble onto your affair. I'm Rachel Martinez, the owner of Skyline Flight Academy. You work for me, and you've been using my business to conduct criminal fraud operations while seducing my husband." The silence that followed my revelation was profound and electric. Ashley's face went through a series of expressions as she processed the implications of what I'd just told her. Derek staggered backward as if he'd been physically struck, his hand reaching out to steady himself against Ashley's desk as the full scope of the situation became clear to him. "That's impossible," Ashley whispered, her voice barely audible as she stared at me with growing horror. "The academy owner is a silent partner. Nobody knows who actually owns this place. Nobody except my attorney, my family, and the federal agents who are about to arrest you for fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy, I replied. Did you really think you could run con games on flight students without eventually targeting someone with enough resources and connections to stop you? Derek's voice came out as a strangled croak. Rachel, you own this place? You've owned it all along, and you never told me? I inherited it from my grandfather 3 years ago and transformed it into one of the most successful academies in Texas, I explained. Watching Derek struggle to reconcile his image of me as a small-time accountant with the reality of my aviation business empire. You've been training at my academy, Derek. Every lesson you took with Ashley was paid for with my money. Every aircraft you flew belonged to me, and every intimate moment you shared with her happened on my property while she was my employee. The devastation on Derek's face was complete as he realized the full scope of his betrayal and foolishness. He'd been cheating on his wife with an employee of his wife's business, using his wife's resources to fund his affair, and allowing himself to be manipulated into criminal schemes that threatened his wife's legitimate enterprises. Ashley made a sudden movement toward the exit, but Agent Collins chose that moment to step into the office with her credentials displayed. Ashley Brooks, I'm Special Agent Collins with the FBI. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and violation of federal aviation regulations. The sight of federal agents surrounding the office area sent Ashley into complete panic. She looked around desperately for an escape route, but Agent Collins's team had positioned themselves to block all exits. Derek stood frozen in shock, apparently unable to process the rapid escalation from routine academy visit to federal arrest operation. Derek Thompson, we need to speak with you about your involvement in Ms. Brooks' financial schemes. Agent Collins continued, You're not under arrest at this time, but we strongly recommend that you cooperate with our investigation. I watched with grim satisfaction as handcuffs were placed on Ashley's wrists and her rights were read aloud. The confident, manipulative woman who had seduced my husband and threatened my business was reduced to a panicked criminal facing decades in federal prison. Her schemes had finally caught up with her, and the consequences would be severe. Derek remained speechless as Ashley was led away, his gaze following her progress until she disappeared from view. Then he turned back to me with an expression of complete desolation, apparently beginning to understand that his life had just changed irrevocably. Rachel, I didn't know, he said weakly. I had no idea about any criminal activity. Ashley told me everything was legitimate business consulting work. Derek, you tried to mortgage our house to give $200,000 to a woman you'd known for 4 months, I replied coldly. You abandoned me at an airport to fly to Denver with your lover. You lied to me repeatedly about your whereabouts and activities. Whether or not you knew about Ashley's criminal schemes, you made choices that demonstrated complete disrespect for our marriage and our shared financial security. Agent Collins approached us with a professional but sympathetic expression. Mrs. Martinez, we'll need to conduct interviews with both of you over the next few days to gather information about Ashley's activities and Derek's potential involvement. Based on preliminary evidence, it appears that Derek was a victim of Ashley's manipulation rather than a willing accomplice, but we need to verify that through formal questioning. I nodded, understanding that the legal process would be complex and time-consuming. Agent Collins, I want to ensure that Derek receives appropriate legal representation during your investigation. Despite everything that's happened, I don't want him to face criminal charges if he was genuinely unaware of Ashley's true nature. Derek looked at me with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. Rachel, after everything I've done to you, why would you want to protect me from criminal charges? Because despite your betrayal, I don't believe you're actually a criminal, I replied. You're guilty of infidelity, dishonesty, and terrible judgment. But I don't think you knowingly participated in fraud schemes. Ashley targeted you because of your connection to me, and she manipulated your career ambitions to make you vulnerable to her schemes. The afternoon dissolved into a blur of interviews evidence collection, and legal consultations as federal agents worked to document Ashley's criminal activities and determine the extent of Derek's involvement. I provided extensive testimony about Ashley's employment history, her unauthorized access to student records, and the pattern of inappropriate relationships that had emerged through our investigation. Derek's interview was longer and more intense, as agents worked to establish exactly what he knew about Ashley's business activities and when he might have become aware that her consulting work was fraudulent. The questioning was thorough but not accusatory, reflecting Agent Collins's assessment that Derek had been manipulated rather than complicit in criminal activity. By evening, it was clear that Derek would not face criminal charges, but the damage to our marriage was irreparable. He had betrayed my trust, attempted to steal our shared assets, and demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for our relationship. The fact that he'd been victimized by Ashley's criminal schemes didn't excuse his choices or eliminate the consequences of his betrayal. "Rachel, I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness," Derek said as we prepared to leave the academy after hours of interviews and evidence collection, "but I want you to know that I never intended for any of this to happen. I thought I was making smart career moves and building relationships that would benefit both of us." "Derek, your intentions don't matter anymore," I replied sadly. "You made a series of choices that showed you were willing to lie to me, cheat on me, and steal from me when it served your purposes. Ashley may have manipulated you, but you chose to be available for manipulation." I drove home alone that evening, leaving Derek to find his own transportation and figure out his own living arrangements. The house felt different when I entered it, not empty and violated as it had during Derek's absence, but peaceful and truly mine for the first time in years. I poured myself a glass of wine and called Nicole to update her on the day's dramatic events. "How do you feel?" Nicole asked after I'd described Ashley's arrest and Derek's interrogation. "Vindicated," I replied without hesitation. "And relieved that it's finally over. Ashley will face serious prison time for her crimes. Derek will have to live with the consequences of his choices, and I can move forward with rebuilding my life." The truth had indeed set me free, just not in any way I could have anticipated. When I'd first overheard Derek's cruel laughter at the bachelor party that seemed like a lifetime ago. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying someone's world, but simply allowing their own choices to reveal their true character while you build something better from the ruins they leave behind. 6 months after Ashley's arrest, I stood in the renovated conference room at Skyline Flight Academy, watching the morning sun stream through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling tarmac. The academy had not only survived the scandal, but emerged stronger than ever, with a waiting list that stretched 8 months and partnerships with major airlines that were eager to recruit from our ethically managed program. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the immediate aftermath of Ashley's criminal exposure, several students had expressed concerns about the academy's oversight procedures and security protocols. Media coverage of the federal investigation had been intense, with reporters fascinated by the story of the academy owner who'd unknowingly hired a criminal to seduce her own husband. For a few weeks, I'd worried that the negative publicity might damage our reputation permanently. Instead, the opposite had occurred. Aviation industry professionals were impressed by how quickly and thoroughly I'd identified the criminal activity and cooperated with federal authorities to ensure justice was served. The fact that I'd personally uncovered Ashley's schemes while simultaneously discovering my husband's betrayal had generated tremendous sympathy and respect from colleagues, who understood the emotional toll of the situation. Agent Collins had kept me informed about Ashley's prosecution and the broader investigation into the criminal network she'd been part of. Ashley had ultimately pleaded guilty to 17 federal charges including fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy, receiving a sentence of 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. The consulting company she'd used to launder stolen funds was dissolved, and victims across multiple states were slowly recovering assets through the federal restitution process. The investigation had revealed that Ashley's criminal activities were even more extensive than we'd initially discovered. She'd been part of an organized group that specifically targeted aviation businesses because of their access to high-value assets and wealthy clientele. The network had operated across 7 states, with Ashley serving as their specialist in seducing and manipulating male targets who could provide access to aircraft, financial accounts, or business opportunities. Derek's role in the scheme had been definitively established as that of an unwitting victim rather than a criminal accomplice. Agent Collins had explained that Ashley's manipulation tactics were sophisticated and specifically designed to exploit personality traits that made certain individuals vulnerable to financial fraud. Derek's combination of career ambition, marital dissatisfaction, and desire for recognition had made him an ideal target for Ashley's psychological manipulation. "Your husband was selected and groomed with professional precision," Agent Collins had told me during one of our final interviews. Ashley studied his behavior patterns, identified his emotional vulnerabilities, and constructed a false relationship designed to maximize his compliance with her schemes. The fact that he never realized he was being manipulated is actually evidence of how skilled Ashley was at her criminal specialty. The explanation had provided some comfort regarding Derek's victimization, but it hadn't changed my feelings about his fundamental betrayal of our marriage. Even if Ashley had manipulated him skillfully, Derek had still chosen to lie to me, cheat on me, and attempt to steal our shared assets for the benefit of another woman. The criminality of Ashley's schemes didn't excuse Derek's willingness to betray his wedding vows and financial obligations. Our divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, with Derek agreeing to a settlement that reflected his attempted theft of marital assets and the emotional damage caused by his infidelity. He'd kept his job with Southwest Airlines, though his reputation in the aviation community had suffered significantly due to his association with Ashley's criminal activities. Several promotional opportunities had evaporated when his involvement in the scandal became known, and he'd been forced to accept a transfer to a less desirable route assignment. I'd felt no satisfaction in Derek's professional difficulties, but I hadn't felt sympathy either. He was experiencing the natural consequences of choices he'd made freely, and those consequences were relatively mild compared to what could have happened if he'd been criminally charged as an accomplice to Ashley's schemes. The fact that he'd kept his pilot's license and avoided federal prosecution was actually a fortunate outcome, given the severity of Ashley's crimes. Nicole had been invaluable throughout the divorce proceedings, ensuring that Derek's attempted financial theft was properly documented and that I received appropriate compensation for the emotional distress and business disruption caused by his actions. She'd also helped me restructure the Academy's ownership to make my control more transparent while maintaining the privacy protections that had originally been necessary due to my grandfather's estate requirements. "You've handled this entire situation with incredible grace and strength," Nicole had told me after the final divorce papers were signed. "Most people would have been destroyed by this kind of betrayal, but you've turned it into an opportunity to build something even better." The rebuilding process had indeed created opportunities I'd never anticipated. The media attention surrounding Ashley's arrest had led to speaking invitations from aviation organizations across the country, with industry groups eager to learn about fraud prevention and ethical oversight in flight training environments. I'd developed a consulting practice that helped other academies implement security protocols and background verification procedures to prevent similar criminal infiltrations. The speaking engagements had connected me with fascinating people throughout the aviation industry, including Dr. Michael Chen, a former Air Force pilot who now served as Director of Aviation Safety for a major aircraft manufacturer. Michael had attended one of my presentations at an industry conference in Denver, and we'd discovered a shared passion for improving safety standards and ethical practices in aviation education. Our professional relationship had gradually evolved into something more personal over the months following my divorce. Michael understood the unique challenges of the aviation industry and appreciated both my business acumen and my commitment to maintaining the highest ethical standards. Unlike Derek, who'd seen my success as something to exploit for his own benefit, Michael respected my achievements and encouraged my continued growth as both a business leader and industry advocate. Your experience with Ashley's criminal infiltration has given you insights that could revolutionize how we approach security and aviation training, Michael had said during one of our dinner conversations. You've identified vulnerabilities that most academy owners never consider because they assume their hiring processes are adequate protection against sophisticated criminals. The relationship with Michael was developing slowly and carefully, built on mutual respect and shared professional interests rather than the emotional intensity and romantic drama that had characterized my marriage to Derek. I was in no hurry to make major commitments, having learned valuable lessons about the importance of truly knowing someone before trusting them with access to my personal and professional life. Lisa had been instrumental in helping me process the emotional aftermath of Derek's betrayal and develop confidence in my ability to make better relationship choices in the future. My sister's investigative skills had been crucial in exposing Ashley's criminal background, and her continued support had helped me maintain perspective during the most difficult phases of the divorce and business rebuilding process. You're a completely different person than you were a year ago, Lisa observed during one of our weekly phone calls. You're more confident, more decisive, and more willing to trust your own instincts about people and situations. Derek's betrayal was devastating, but it forced you to develop strengths you didn't know you had. James Carter had been promoted to executive director of Skyline Academy, with expanded responsibilities for oversight and security that reflected the lessons we'd learned from Ashley's criminal infiltration. His loyalty and professionalism during the federal investigation had been exemplary, and I'd wanted to ensure he was appropriately rewarded for his dedication to the Academy's integrity and success. The new background verification procedures you've implemented are becoming the industry standard, James reported during one of our weekly management meetings. 3 other academies have contacted us this month asking for advice on implementing similar security protocols. The Academy's reputation for ethical management and thorough oversight had become a significant competitive advantage, attracting students and instructors who valued integrity and professional standards above all else. Our graduation rates remained exceptional, and our alumni were being recruited aggressively by major airlines that appreciated the quality and character of pilots trained in our program. I'd also used the experience to establish a scholarship fund for aviation students who'd been victims of fraud or educational scams. The fund provided financial assistance and mentoring support to help worthy candidates complete their training despite setbacks caused by criminal activity or predatory educational practices. Several recipients had already graduated from our program and were building successful careers as commercial pilots. The most unexpected development had been my appointment to the Federal Aviation Administration's Advisory Committee on Educational Standards and Oversight. My experience with Ashley's criminal infiltration had convinced FAA officials that existing regulations were inadequate to address sophisticated fraud schemes targeting aviation education providers. The committee was developing new requirements for background verification, financial oversight, and reporting procedures that would make it much more difficult for criminals to exploit flight training environments. Your first-hand experience with educational fraud has given you credibility that most committee members lack, explained Dr. Patricia Williams, the FAA official who'd recruited me for the advisory role. You understand both the business realities of running a flight academy and the sophisticated methods that criminals use to infiltrate and exploit these environments. The committee work was demanding but fulfilling, providing opportunities to influence industry standards and prevent other academy owners from experiencing the kind of criminal infiltration that had nearly destroyed my business and personal life. The regulatory changes we were developing would require significant investments in security and oversight, but the protection they provided against criminal activity would justify the costs. 1 year after Ashley's arrest, I received an unexpected letter from Derek requesting a meeting to discuss what he described as important information about Ashley's criminal network. His letter was formal and apologetic, acknowledging the damage his actions had caused while suggesting that his continued cooperation with federal investigators had uncovered new information that might be relevant to my ongoing security concerns. I agreed to meet Derek at a neutral location, curious about what additional information he might have discovered and willing to hear him out if it could help protect other potential victims of similar criminal schemes. We met at a coffee shop near the airport, choosing a public location that would keep the conversation professional and prevent any misunderstandings about my motivations for agreeing to see him. Derek looked older and more subdued than I remembered, his confidence replaced by what appeared to be genuine remorse and hard-earned humility. He'd lost weight and developed lines around his eyes that suggested he'd been experiencing significant stress since our divorce was finalized. "Rachel, thank you for agreeing to see me," Derek began, his voice carrying none of the arrogant charm that had once attracted me to him. "I know I have no right to ask for your time, but Agent Collins suggested that you should hear what I've learned about Ashley's activities before she was arrested." "What kind of information?" I asked, maintaining professional distance while acknowledging that anything related to Ashley's criminal network could potentially affect the Academy's security or my personal safety. Derek explained that continued federal investigation had revealed that Ashley's criminal group had been planning to expand their operations significantly, with Skyline Academy identified as a potential headquarters for coordinating fraud schemes across the southeastern United States. My academy's excellent reputation and financial success had made it an attractive target for criminal takeover, and Ashley's seduction of Derek had been part of a larger plan to gain control of the business through manipulation and financial fraud. Ashley wasn't just running individual cons on flight students, Derek explained. She was working to position herself to take over entire academies by seducing owners or key employees and gradually gaining access to business operations and financial accounts. If you hadn't discovered her activities when you did, she might have eventually gained enough influence to force you out of your own business. The revelation was chilling but not entirely surprising given what we'd learned about Ashley's sophisticated criminal methods and her involvement with organized fraud networks. The fact that my academy had been specifically targeted for criminal takeover rather than random infiltration explained Ashley's willingness to extend her usual pattern of quick exploitation and early departure. Agent Collins wanted you to know that your discovery of Ashley's activities probably prevented a much larger criminal operation that could have affected dozens of aviation businesses across multiple states, Derek continued. The federal investigation has used information from Ashley's case to identify and arrest other members of her criminal network, including people who were planning similar infiltrations at academies in Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern, knowing that my actions had helped prevent other business owners from experiencing the kind of betrayal and criminal victimization that Ashley had attempted. The scope of the planned criminal operations was staggering, and I realized how fortunate I'd been to discover Ashley's true nature before she could implement more devastating schemes. "Derek, I appreciate you sharing this information," I said carefully. "But I hope you understand that it doesn't change anything about our relationship or the consequences of your choices." "I understand completely," Derek replied. "I'm not trying to earn forgiveness or rebuild our relationship. I just wanted you to know that your courage in exposing Ashley's crimes prevented a lot of other people from being victimized, and I'm grateful that you were strong enough to do what needed to be done." The conversation with Derek provided closure on questions I hadn't realized I still had about Ashley's motivations and the broader implications of her criminal activities. It also reinforced my conviction that discovering Derek's betrayal, as painful as it had ultimately saved me from much worse consequences that could have resulted from Ashley's long-term infiltration plans. 2 years after the terminal incident that had changed my life forever, I stood before the largest aviation industry conference in the country, preparing to deliver the keynote address on fraud prevention and ethical oversight in aviation education. The audience included academy owners, airline executives, federal regulators, and industry leaders from across North America, all eager to hear about the lessons learned from Ashley's criminal infiltration and the security improvements that had resulted from federal investigations. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, looking out at the packed auditorium. 2 years ago, I thought I was simply a successful academy owner with a happy marriage and a thriving business. I had no idea that my husband was being systematically manipulated by a criminal who worked for me, or that my academy had been targeted for takeover by an organized fraud network. I told the story of Ashley's infiltration and Derek's betrayal, emphasizing the sophisticated methods that criminals use to exploit both personal relationships and professional environments in the aviation industry. The audience was captivated by the details of how Ashley had manipulated Derek while simultaneously gathering intelligence about academy operations and student information for broader criminal purposes. The most important lesson I learned was that criminals don't look like criminals, I continued. Ashley Brooks appeared to be an exceptionally qualified flight instructor with impressive credentials and professional references. She passed all standard background checks and quickly became one of our most popular instructors. The only way to identify her criminal activities was through careful observation of patterns and a willingness to investigate when something didn't feel right. After the presentation, I was approached by dozens of academy owners and industry professionals who wanted to discuss their own security concerns and learn more about the prevention strategies we'd implemented at Skyline. Many shared stories of suspicious incidents or concerning employee behavior that they'd dismissed or ignored, recognizing in retrospect that they might have been dealing with similar criminal infiltration attempts. Michael accompanied me to the conference, and our relationship had evolved to the point where we were seriously discussing marriage and the possibility of combining our professional expertise to create new aviation safety initiatives. His support and understanding had been invaluable as I'd rebuilt my personal life and expanded my professional influence within the industry. "You've turned a devastating personal betrayal into a platform for protecting other people from similar experiences," Michael observed as we walked through the conference exhibition hall. "That kind of resilience and commitment to serving others is exactly why I fell in love with you." The evening concluded with an awards ceremony where I received recognition for my contributions to aviation security and ethical education standards. Standing on the stage, holding an award that represented the industry's appreciation for my work, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Derek's betrayal had initially felt like the end of my world, but it had actually been the beginning of a much better life. I'd discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed, built professional relationships that enriched both my business and personal experiences, and found love with someone who appreciated my achievements rather than trying to exploit them for his own benefit. Ashley's criminal schemes had been designed to destroy my business and steal my assets, but they'd ultimately made me stronger, wiser, and more successful than I'd ever imagined possible. The academy was thriving, my consulting practice was helping protect other businesses from similar criminal infiltration, and my work with federal regulators was improving security standards throughout the aviation industry. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own instincts and value my own worth, rather than allowing others to define my identity or limit my potential. Derek had seen me as a convenient source of financial support and social status, never recognizing or appreciating my actual capabilities and achievements. Ashley had viewed me as an obstacle to be eliminated, rather than a formidable opponent capable of exposing her crimes and ensuring her prosecution. Their fundamental misunderstanding of who I was had been their downfall, and my willingness to stand up for truth and justice had been my salvation. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies, but about building something so successful and meaningful that their betrayal becomes irrelevant to your happiness and fulfillment. Walking out of the conference hall that evening, hand in hand with Michael and surrounded by colleagues who respected my contributions to the industry, I realized that I'd gained everything I'd truly wanted from life. The pain of Derek's betrayal and Ashley's criminal infiltration had faded into distant memories, replaced by excitement about future opportunities and gratitude for the strength I'd discovered during my darkest moments. The woman who'd been abandoned at Terminal B 2 years ago had been naive and trusting, willing to accept betrayal rather than fight for justice. The woman leaving this conference was confident, accomplished, and absolutely certain of her own worth. Derek and Ashley had tried to destroy me, but they'd actually set me free to become the person I was always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.